Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thanks very much for coming. As Verona Pharma, we're a dual listed company on both AIM and NASDAQ. AIM since 2006 and NASDAQ since 2017. So the usual forward-looking statements. But essentially our focus is on respiratory. We have a molecule, ensifentrine, which is a dual bronchodilator and an anti-inflammatory in a single molecule. It's delivered via inhalation. It's a novel mode of action, so adds on to both the antimuscarinics and the beta agonists, which are the two main existing classes of bronchodilators. It works very well as both a monotherapy and as an add-on therapy. We have done a number of phase 2 studies. We've now treated more than 1,200 patients or subjects. Very well tolerated, very safe, but also in studies out to 4 weeks in over 800 patients. We've shown a very nice sustained bronchodilation effect and an improvement in symptoms. We also have inhaler formulations. These are lower price but much larger volume markets, which are potentially a partnering opportunity with Big Pharma. We have an experienced management team, and we also have the opportunity to expand into other indications outside of COPD, such as asthma, cystic fibrosis, and other orphan respiratory diseases. So in terms of the COPD market, this is our first indication that we're pursuing. If you take the US, you have about 6 million patients who are currently on treatment, and about 3 million of those patients are on maximum therapies. So they're on both types of bronchodilators, antimuscarinics and beta agonists, but about 40% of those patients are still failing. They're symptomatic and there are no further therapeutic options for them. So that is a 1.2 million patient population that we can address and who urgently need something else. COPD is the third leading cause of death in the US after cancer and cardiovascular disease. So it's a big unmet need and a real opportunity. China is a big market as well. It's obviously a huge issue in terms of smoking history, in terms of air quality, two of the main causes of COPD. COPD, about 25% of patients have never actually smoked. It is down to environmental pollution in the workplace, in the home. So a large number of patients there, about 70 million. Clearly that's not something which we are going to try and commercialize ourselves, but it's a big partnering opportunity. So in terms of COPD, as I said, there are two main things that you want to do with the airways. The first is to bronchodilate, to relax the airways and enable the air as a short-term improvement to be able to be exhaled in particular. A lot of air gets trapped in the lungs and these patients end up with a hyperinflated chest. But the longer-term challenge is also to relieve the inflammation that's in those airways. So you want to have both a bronchodilator and an anti-inflammatory. And apologies, the formatting on the slides has gone a little bit astray. So in terms of the mode of action, it's a dual inhibitor of two enzymes, PDE3 and PDE4. The PDE3 inhibition is associated with the bronchodilation in the airways. The PDE4 is associated with a broad spectrum of anti-inflammatory activity. It knocks down a range of different inflammatory cells, neutrophils, eosinophils, and so on. It's important to talk a little bit about neutrophils and eosinophils. The eosinophils are primarily associated with inflammation in asthma. And that's why inhaled steroids work very well in asthmatics. They reduce the eosinophils and patients do very well when treated with inhaled steroids in asthma. Inflammation in COPD and also in cystic fibrosis is driven by a different type of inflammatory cell, the neutrophils. And inhaled steroids really have little effect on neutrophil counts. And that's why in COPD, although inhaled steroids are widely used, they have little effect for most patients. But PDE4 will reduce neutrophil counts and will therefore address the inflammation in COPD patients. We also have an impact on the CFTR channel, which is important for CF patients. That's the mode of action for Kalydeco, for example. But what we think is more important for CF patients is actually a genotype agnostic anti-inflammatory treatment. And again, as I said, the inflammation in cystic fibrosis is driven by neutrophils. There is currently little that CF patients can tolerate as an anti-inflammatory, so we think there's a real opportunity there in CF. but our focus initially is on COPD. We think that's obviously a much bigger market, and we think we can get to market pretty quickly compared to CF, where Vertex has done a good job of making those clinical studies much longer. In terms of the positioning, so as I said, patients typically will start off on either a LABA, beta agonist, or a LAMA, an antimuscarinic. But fairly quickly they can progress on to being on LAMA and LABA, and at that point there's really nothing else in terms of bronchodilation that a physician can do for them. You can't cure COPD, but you can improve the patient's quality of life. And if you can give them additional bronchodilation on top of the existing therapies, that's the real opportunity. And as I said, about 40% of patients on maximum therapy are still symptomatic, still struggling for something else, struggling to breathe, and really the physicians are looking for additional treatment modalities to add on. And we think we've shown that ensifentrine will add on to LAMA dual therapy. And as I said, many patients are also on the inhaled steroids, but those are of little benefit. But we have seen that the inhaled steroids, we can add on to those as well. So as I said, going back to the market size, 1.2 million of patients need additional therapy. About 400,000 of those regularly use nebulizers, and the pricing is around $1,000 a month for nebulized therapy, so $12,000 per annum, 400,000 patients. You don't need to get a very large proportion of that patient population to get a very large size revenue opportunity. And actually, given that those patients are all struggling to breathe, we think that there is a real opportunity to get significant market penetration there. Sorry, I should also say the reimbursement is Part B for nebulizers. So that means actually there's very little copay for these patients. For the inhalers, it's typically Part D, but because the nebulizer itself is a durable piece of medical equipment, it gets reimbursed. And that's why you see high levels of nebulizer usage in the US as compared to Europe or other territories. We've generated quite a lot of data. We've now done 15 studies, as I said, with over 1,250 subjects enrolled. This was some data we released a couple of weeks ago. This was a 4-week study as an add-on to tiotropium. Tiotropium is the mainstay treatment. It's one of the first antimuscarinics that physicians will typically use for a patient who's newly diagnosed. So we had a 2-week run-in on background, made sure the patients still met the inclusion criteria, and then 4 weeks treatment and 5 parallel groups, each of about 80 patients, placebo or 4 active doses, with the tiotropium as a background therapy. And what you can see is a nice dose ordering. All of the doses were statistically significant in terms of lung function improvement, but also what we showed was the 3 milligram dose works very nicely. You get an improvement of over 120 ml. That is really something that is significant. We haven't done a head-to-head study, but if you were to put a beta agonist on top of tiotropium, in the reported literature, you typically see an improvement of about 60 ml. So we've pretty much doubled that with the top dose of ensifentrine. So that's a very impressive result, and if you talk to the KOLs, they're really excited about that. But what they're even more excited about is the symptom improvement, because at the end of the day, a patient doesn't go to his doctor saying, my FEV1, my volume of air expired is only 92 and I'd like it to be 105. They say, I'm struggling to breathe, my chest is tight, I'm coughing. So this is a patient-reported outcome. It's a FDA-validated questionnaire, SGRQ. And 2 things you can see. Firstly, you see a progression and an improvement from week 4 compared to week 2. And that's important because if you're taking a bronchodilator, you feel better on day 1, but actually you've then reached peak effect pretty much immediately. So you'll see that symptom improvement, but it will be stable from week 1 to week 2 to week 3, week 4. So what you're seeing is a progressive improvement here, and that's linked to the anti-inflammatory effect, which takes a much longer time to come through. So that is showing we have both the bronchodilation, which is the PDE3 effect, but also the anti-inflammatory effect, which is the PDE4 linked. But what's also important is you get within 4 weeks to the minimum, the MCID, the clinically important difference, and there's very few therapies in COPD which have achieved that. You have Trelegy, which is 3 drugs in a single device, which gets to that point, but that's over 6 months. And I think there's one other, aclidinium, which is one of the LAMAs, which will get to that point, but nothing else really has reached this level of clinical improvement. And this was on a background therapy, one of the mainstays, one of the most commonly used drugs to treat COPD. So already on top of something, one of the leading drugs, we're still getting a clinically important improvement. So that is something which has really got the KOLs excited. So only 15 minutes, but basically the other important takeaway is that it's very safe. The adverse event profile was placebo-like, no drug-related SAEs, and we think this data gives us a very strong message to take to FDA for the end of phase 2 meeting, which will be in the next quarter, and then we're looking to move into phase 3 studies in the second half of 2020. So a really substantial market opportunity and a compound that is subject to FDA's approval, but we think a solid data set and ready to go into phase 3. This was just a study in healthy volunteers, just showing the broad spectrum of anti-inflammatory activity against a range of different cell counts. And given the time, as I said, we've done 15 studies, so I'll skip forward to what does the phase 3 program actually look like. So just skip through these. But essentially the phase 3 that we plan to do is very similar to the nebulized antimuscarinic, which was approved by FDA in November 2018, which is called revefenacin. Trade name is Yupelri. It was a compound that was developed by Mylan and Theravance. And essentially what you need to do is to show that in a real-world setting, so a mix of patients on no background or on a single bronchodilator background, that you can achieve a statistically significant improvement in lung function. So we'll do 2 studies each of 6 months. The bronchodilation effect will be measured after 3 months, and the symptom data will be measured after 6 months. The symptom data will be for the label, but it won't be the approvable endpoint. That will be the bronchodilation. We've shown already in 2 4-week studies, one as a monotherapy and one as an add-on to tiotropium, that we can meet that endpoint. So we think actually the phase 3 is relatively low risk. You're really just carrying on from 1 month to 6 months, and will that treatment effect be maintained over the longer period? But when we've looked at what week 1 to week 4, we don't see any significant change in the effect, so we don't anticipate seeing a change in effect going out to 6 months treatment, particularly because we're not acting on a receptor, but we're acting on the enzyme inhibition. We will, in parallel, do an add-on to dual therapy. So this is going to be important for the positioning with physicians, but importantly, with this phase 3 package, Yupelri got a label for the chronic maintenance treatment of COPD patients. That means it can be used on COPD patients at any stage. We think the most important opportunity is for patients on maximum therapy, but talking with physicians, they would actually be interested in using it as an add-on to a single therapy, or to even in some cases, they'd be interested in seeing it as first line. And talking with many of the KOLs, what they're interested in doing is putting patients onto maximum treatment as early as possible, because these patients exacerbate. When they exacerbate, unlike in asthma, they do not rebound immediately. They have often a permanent decrease in lung function. So it's a step down on top of an already accelerated deterioration in lung function. So I'm conscious that I'm going to be running out of time momentarily. We have 2 further formulations. These are looking at the inhalers, doing a proof of concept. It's a much bigger patient population. As I said before, 400,000 of the 6 million US patients regularly use nebulizers. That means 5.6 million of them are preferring to use the convenience of an inhaler. So it's the same active compound, but just can it be formulated for inhalers? I think given the time, I'd like to then just open it up to any questions over the last minute or two. I don't know if there are any questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I'll just add on then. Severe asthma, there are IL-5 antibodies that were being repurposed by GSK AZ into COPD. They didn't work because they work on the eosinophils, not neutrophils. That proves both the importance of having an anti-neutrophilic approach in COPD, but it also shows there is a market opportunity of several hundred million in severe asthma with an antibody at $30,000 per annum. But if you can come in with a small molecule at a third of the price, I think you would position yourself before those antibodies and have a chance to reach a wider pool of patients as well, because the the uptake is, if you look at many of the European healthcare systems, limited just by the budget availability. So we think that severe asthma is an obvious additional add-on. Cystic fibrosis I mentioned earlier, and then there's a range of other orphan diseases in the respiratory space that can be targeted. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and very happy to follow up afterwards if there are any other questions.